I'd like to begin by posing some questions. What if the inner voice that tells us that we are wrong, bad, too much or not enough is there for protection? What if our perfectionism, self-doubt and imposter syndrome are all strategies to keep us safe? What if I told you that if we want to change or improve our lives, that we need to change our relationship with shame? Approximately 12 years ago, I had an experience that completely changed my life. For the better, although it didn't feel like that at the time. I was a psychotherapist and I thought that I understood emotion, but nothing could have prepared me for this event. I received a letter to say that I was being investigated professionally. And I had an immediate feeling that I was going to be annihilated and destroyed. My inner critic told me that I was so bad that I couldn't face another person, that I would have to leave where I lived, that my career was coming to an end. It even told me that I was going to prison. After 2 weeks of this emotional turmoil, I received another letter to say that there was no call to answer, and in fact, the investigator was really complimentary about my work. But what this experience allowed me to do for the first time was to name the emotion of those 2 weeks, and that emotion was shame. I also realized that I had experienced what I now call uncontained shame my whole life, starting in childhood. In childhood, it would be activated by getting into trouble, mum and dad shouting at me, my friends not wanting to play with me at school. And I would get a kick to the gut. I would feel like I was about to be rejected, that nobody loved me, and although that feeling was temporary, it always felt devastating. So this experience allowed me to discover a second, probably more shocking or surprising thing to me, and that was my whole life I had devised strategies to make sure that I didn't feel uncontained shame. These strategies were so unconscious and embedded in me that it actually felt like it was my personality. It felt like this is who I was. These strategies would get me to be the good girl, to never express emotion, to actually disavow and split off from my anger. Because if I didn't, I was at the risk of being vulnerable and that uncontained shame could come up. I decided to go into therapy, as all good psychotherapists would do, and that wasn't particularly successful. I looked at the self-help literature on shame, and that didn't mirror my experience of these strategies. I was, as I said, working as a psychotherapist, and my clients were presenting with shame, and the professional literature didn't give me anything to help me to help them. And the purpose of this wasn't to work on the uncontained shame, it was to address the strategies that were keeping me stuck. So even though I knew that these strategies were protective, they were keeping me small, they were making me hide, and they weren't allowing me to fulfill my potential. At this point of frustration, after several years of trying to find different ways of helping me understand my shame, I decided to embark on a PhD and become a shame researcher. And as a result of that PhD, I developed Shame Containment Theory. And what I would like to do now is to share some of the things that I discovered through this 7-year PhD endeavour. Shame is a vital part of our attachment system. Its design is for protection from disconnection through connection. Its purpose is to keep us attached to caregivers and other important adults in our lives, even when those attachment figures cause us harm, because it's the only thing that we know. We can't risk the experience of disconnection from these attachment figures because we don't know what else is there. The other thing that I discovered was shame obviously is an emotion, but it's more than that. It's a complicated system of different strategies that allow us to stay protected. Shame develops in childhood and is with us our whole lives because it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be with us. Within this system, we start with attachment injuries. And attachment injuries are moments of disconnection without reconnection to our caregivers and other important adults in our lives. Attachment injuries may be overt, physical, sexual abuse, but often it's things like silent scorn, it's unavailability, it's disinterest. It doesn't take much to create an attachment injury in a child. When we have these moments of disconnection, our shame presents itself as a protective mechanism to put us in the position of bad child so we can strive to be good. Because when we are good, our caregivers will want to reconnect back up with us. Or our shame will tell us that there's parts of us that are unacceptable. And for me, that was my anger, amongst many other things. So this is the key, really, to understanding shame, is that shame is always protective. It will make us modify our behaviour, it will make us change who we think we are, as long as those things get us to be different, so we are acceptable. This protective shame response that tells us that we are, say, bad, wrong, too much, not enough. We can't allow for this shame response to be seen. We can't allow for the shame messages that we are given as part of this protective response to be seen by anybody else. And this is what I call contained shame. Contained shame, you could describe it as the everyday shame that tells us that we are flawed, or that if anyone was to see who we really were, they would leave. It's our constant companion. It's what we don't often recognize as shame. Often we just think this is who we are. Uncontained shame is the acute, devastating moment when this contained shame is felt by us or seen by others. It's when we make a mistake at work, it's when we get called out. It's when we are seen, because the thing with shame is we are desperate to be seen and desperate not to be seen at the same time. Uncontained shame can be felt on a spectrum from mild embarrassment through to annihilation, through to the point where we feel like the only option that we have is to disappear. What we need to do to avoid this devastation of uncontained shame is develop what I call shame containment strategies. Shame containment strategies are designed to keep that contained shame in its place, and for me, it's here. We have them to protect ourselves from the horrendous experience of uncontained shame. But our shame containment strategies, they can be really, really helpful because we are pro-social after all. So things like politeness, good manners, conscientiousness, they are all shame containment strategies. People who speak on TED Talks practice and practice and practice. Our practice is a shame containment strategy to make sure that we don't look silly on stage. But our shame containment strategies, things like perfectionism, avoiding relationships, not expressing what we really feel, lying, deceiving ourselves, numbing out with drug and alcohol, or other mechanisms that we have. They are all shame containment strategies that are keeping us limited, that are potentially keeping us stuck. And finally, we have recontainment strategies, because when we have this acute devastation of uncontained shame, we need some way of managing that experience. We need something to make sure that we can get that uncontained shame back in its contained state. So when we make a mistake at work and we are ruminating and overthinking about the conversation that we are going to have to make the situation better, or when something happens and we feel really angry and we are either attacking ourselves or attacking someone else. These aren't flaws. These are the ways that we are rescuing ourselves from the devastation of uncontained shame. When I was able to understand shame as this protective mechanism and shame as this whole system, that's when things changed for me. I was able to see that the attachment injuries that I had experienced as a child, they weren't my fault, but shame told me that they were. Shame did this to keep me protected, but also to keep me connected, because again, this is how I was going to modify and change my behavior. This is how I was going to make myself as acceptable as possible. But what I also discovered was the shame scripts that I had developed, they weren't accurate, they weren't true, but shame had to make me believe it, because if it didn't, it wasn't doing its job. Shame has to be painful, because if it's not, we won't take notice, and we really need to listen to shame. When I was able to look at these shame scripts, or the contained shame, as I call it, I was able to see that they weren't accurate. I am a lovable, worthwhile person. And I was able to see myself through the eyes of reality rather than through the lens of shame. I began to look at the shame containment strategies that I had developed, and I looked to see which ones were being problematic, which ones were getting in the way, which ones were keeping me stuck, and which ones were really, really useful. When I started to address the contained shame that I had and shift those scripts and bring them into reality, a lot of the shame containment strategies that I had started to just naturally dissolve. I even recognized that my uncontained shame was protective. And I know this might sound really paradoxical considering how painful uncontained shame can feel. Because our uncontained shame is an alarm. It tells us that we are not safe. But the thing is with shame is that it doesn't always have the story right. Our shame develops in childhood, and it's still convinced that we are that 3-year-old person, that 3-year-old child who is vulnerable and needs protecting. And finally, with my recontainment strategies, rather than them just coming up and being problematic, which they often are, I was able to preempt strategies. I was able to create strategies that I could pick up when I needed to. And the most beneficial one for me is connection. Connection with safe people. Because our shame wants us to disconnect, it wants us to hide, and that's the paradox. In the disconnection, we are safer, but ultimately, we want to really connect. Things began to shift with me when I was able to put all of the pictures of this puzzle together, the puzzle of shame. And what I've been able to do is to have a relationship in which I am fully seen. I can be fully vulnerable, knowing that I'm going to be accepted because I am lovable. I've been able to say yes to opportunities that I couldn't possibly imagine. I'm stood on this stage today simply because I've been able to work with and change my relationship with shame. I'm able to say no because I no longer need to people please. My inner critic, I've been able to change my relationship with that, and now I call it my inner protector, because I now recognize what that voice is trying to do. So I'd like to offer you an invitation. And that invitation is to notice. It's to notice when your shame may be present for you. And I'd like you to be really curious about what is your shame trying to protect you from? What is your shame trying to help you with? I'd also like you to think about, does shame have the story right? I'd like you to notice when your shame containment strategies are there and do the same thing. Be really curious. What are your shame containment strategies trying to help you with? Are they still needed, or are they beginning to get in the way? And I'd like you to be curious about what your life would be like if you could change your relationship with shame. Thank you.